In 1616, the final of Japan's three great unifiers, the legendary Tokugawa Ieyasu, the leader who had established the Tokugawa Shogunate and ushered in the new Edo period, passed away peacefully at the age of 73. In the previous episode of this series, we saw the initial steps he had taken to establish this new era of peace and stability out of the violence and ashes of the war-torn Sengoku Jidai. However, his actual tenure as shogun did not last long, retiring by 1605, just 2 years after claiming the title, a purposeful move as he would maintain his grip over the nation for the remainder of his life, ensuring a smooth transition and continued progress. Yet it was his son Tokugawa Hidetada who was to succeed him, taking up the title upon his father's retirement. Hidetada was a man with a somewhat troubled past and a large and intimidating act to follow. The years ahead would truly show if he was up to the task. In this video, we shall examine Hidetada, his legacy and reign, and how his actions would help to shape the future of the Edo period after taking things over officially from his father, Ieyasu. What was to be the destiny of Hidetada? And ultimately, how would he contribute to building upon the great foundation of the Edo Bakufu? Tokugawa Hidetada was born in Hamamatsu in 1579, the third son of Tokugawa Ieyasu by way of a concubine. He was by no means initially destined for any real greatness, as at the time of his birth, he had two older brothers ahead of him to inherit what they could from their father. Unfortunately though, and also lucky enough for Hidetada, his eldest brother Nobuyasu, who was around 20 years old at the time of Hidetada's birth, was not to be around for long. In 1579, Nobuyasu's mother, Ieyasu's first wife, the Lady Tsukiyama, was rumored to be engaging in acts of treason against the Oda. This erupted in a series of sad events that left Ieyasu with no other choice than to order the deaths of both of them. So quickly, we can see how Hidetada moved up to being second in line, and it would only take another several years before he was the frontrunner. In 1584, as part of the peace deal after the clash between the Toyotomi and Tokugawa at Komaki Nagakute, Ieyasu had to hand over his second son, Hideyasu, over to the Toyotomi as a political hostage. Eventually, he would be transferred to the Yuki family, whom he would come to succeed. This meant that, soon enough, Hidetada had become the primary heir to Ieyasu's growing domain. Yet although he had come to be such a significant figure simply through succession, he had little actual renown to his name for any great deeds that he had accomplished. This leads to the speculation that he may have wanted to fix the issue by the time of the Sekigahara conflict in 1600, where he had a real opportunity to finally earn a name for himself through warfare. It was here, while his father was trying to seize the nation for himself after the passing of Toyotomi Hideyoshi 2 years prior, that Hidetada would be given an important task. The great armies of the Tokugawa were to march west and deal with Ishida Mitsunari and his western army of Toyotomi loyalists. But while Ieyasu was to travel up along the Tokaido Road, Hidetada was instructed to take the Nakasendo, a path which would lead him by the hostile Ueda Castle, home to the Toyotomi loyal Sanada Masayuki. Hidetada was to leave a token force behind to mask the castle, and then continue on to link up with his father. However, he had other plans entirely. To what many assume today was a simple attempt by Hidetada to earn glory and fame, he pressed hard to actually seize Ueda. We actually covered this entire event in episode 55 of my Sengoku Jidai series. Yet, just like 15 years prior, the Sanada held firm in the face of the Tokugawa advance. Hidetada would never take Ueda, and when he finally realized his blunder and tried to rush to meet his father in the west, he would never arrive in time to support him at Sekigahara. This nearly resulted in his father's defeat, were it not for the turncoats who betrayed the Western army and gave Ieyasu the edge he needed to break Mitsunari's line. Furious at his son's actions and how he may have nearly ruined everything, it is believed that Ieyasu refused to speak with him for some time. This was a shame that Hidetada would have to carry for the rest of his life, and one which would put a great deal of strain on his relationship with his father. With Ieyasu now poised to seize the nation, new doubts about his son's ability to lead would surely have caused a bit of wariness. Hidetada had proven that he was still very inexperienced when it came to military leadership, and this was something which Ieyasu would have been somewhat cautious of. However, due to the fact that it looked as if Japan was on the brink of a new era of peace and stability, this concern may have been one which Ieyasu was more able to look past. Eventually, he and Hidetada were able to reconcile, and Hidetada was to remain Ieyasu's primary heir. 3 years after Ieyasu's victory at Sekigahara, he would be named the new shogun, beginning the age of the Edo Bakufu. Yet as we know, within 2 years he would also retire and hand things off to Hidetada. Yet despite now being the official shogun as of 1605, his power for a time would remain rather limited, as Ieyasu continued to dominate politics for roughly another decade. The act of retiring but remaining in power was a tradition which occurred frequently throughout Japanese history, as it was important to name and pass titles on to an heir while still holding the majority of power, thus ensuring a smooth transition and continuing stability. It was a luxury that Ieyasu's predecessor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, was unable to afford, and one which Ieyasu was all too eager to achieve. From this point, Ieyasu relocated to Sumpu, where he was to act as the Ogosho, or retired shogun, while Hidetada was to remain in Edo. But Hidetada was also part of another one of his father's schemes, for Hidetada's own firstborn daughter, Senhime, who was just around 6 years old at the time, would be wed to the young Toyotomi Hideyori in 1603. Hideyori was the only son and heir of Hideyoshi, and the idea behind this was to keep the Toyotomi in line through the binds of marriage. With any hope, perhaps another war between the two families could have been avoided. Unfortunately, this ultimately wouldn't work, as by 1614 the Tokugawa finally sought to eradicate the Toyotomi after a falling out between Ieyasu and Hideyori. This would all lead to the Great Siege of Osaka, which would finally wipe the Toyotomi out of existence and firmly secure Tokugawa rule over the land. This was also to be a new opportunity for Hidetada to prove himself as a military commander, which one can say he sort of did, as he orchestrated the campaign effectively enough and worked under the command of his father in a cohesive manner to ensure total victory by the summer of 1615. Ieyasu would come to die just 1 year after the end of the siege, which at long last left Hidetada firmly in control of the entire nation. But to say that things would be smooth sailing and that he could essentially put governance over Japan on autopilot would be entirely incorrect, not to mention the notion that his actual legitimacy may have appeared far lesser than his father's, being that Ieyasu had a massive era-defining victory at Sekigahara which secured his position. Hidetada had no such event that held him firmly in his place, other than simply being Ieyasu's son. He would need to work hard to earn his position. The only real effective solution to this now in the new age of peace was to be productive, continuing to build upon and cement the systems that his father and his predecessors had laid the foundations for. There were already plenty of laws, codes, rules, and systems that he and his father had already worked to implement, things which served to restructure the country and bind it together under the reign of the new Bakufu. And to this, we see 3 core elements that Ieyasu would entrust upon Hidetada in order to continue the mission of building the shogunate into the strongest, most effective, and efficient force it could be. These were 1. Forging stronger legitimacy through connections with the imperial court, something Hidetada would later seek to do by marrying his 3rd daughter to the emperor. Not to mention there had also been the previous implementation of the Kinchu Narabini Kuge Shohato, which served to further structure the inner workings of the court and also define their relationship with the samurai class. We've talked about this a few times before. 2 was establishing stability through implementing harsh codes and laws to govern society. In particular, we can look at the samurai class specifically, in terms of things like the Bakuhan system, which define the relationship between the many daimyo and their interaction with the Bakufu. We can also see the Buke Shohato, code-upon warrior households, something we've talked about before, which served to create an elaborate set of laws that all samurai lords throughout the country had to abide by. And lastly, 3, which may be the most important of all, convincing the entire country why such a mighty military government would be necessary, thereby also justifying its at times oppressive nature and means of continuing peace and security. After roughly 150 years of incessant war, the concept of the nation at peace would have been bizarre, not in terms of striving to achieve it and believing in it, but perhaps more so to visualize it, especially among those who had been born and lived through the tail end of the warring era. But securing a lasting peace had been something that Japan had been building to for some time, specifically through the actions of each of the 3 great unifiers. And now, with peace finally achieved, and a new mighty regime in charge, it was time to put all the preparations of the past into a cohesive motion. Of course, one might assume that since the samurai were in firm control of the country, that they were to live as lavish kings, but this was obviously not the case. In order for the shogunate to remain a well-oiled and authoritative machine, the samurai needed to be reined in as much as possible, hence the need for things like the Bakuhan system and the Buke Shohato. And once Hidetada came to power, we can quickly see the oppression of the shogunate come out in full force. Not against someone who could be viewed as actually more rebellious, like Toyotomi Hideyori, but instead upon a figure who really did not appear to have done anything bad at all. This is where we will need to examine a famous incident which would occur in 1619, one which would truly put on full display the extent of harshness this new shogunate would be capable of. One of the new laws put in place by the Buke Shohato was aimed at restricting construction projects on remaining castles, and it was here that all lords had to receive authorization from the shogunate before conducting any maintenance, repairs, or new additions to castles, and the punishment for not getting such authorization, as we will see, was incredibly severe. Thus was the case in 1619, with none other than the famous daimyo Fukushima Masanori. Masanori was a veteran of the Sengoku Jidai and had fought in a multitude of legendary battles and campaigns. He had even been selected to lead the Tokugawa vanguard at Sekigahara, after which he was awarded with Hiroshima Castle from the defeated Mori clan. However, in 1619, flooding had damaged a portion of the castle, causing Masanori to begin efforts to repair sections which needed attention. Now, apparently, he actually had requested authorization from the shogunate before doing so, but after 2 months of not hearing anything about his petition, he decided he could not wait any longer and set to work repairing a section that had been leaking water. Once the shogunate had learned of this, a bitter back and forth began, with the shogunate ordering Masanori to remove all repaired elements of the castle. Yet even after, that was found to be insufficient, and they would at last strip Masanori of his 500,000 koku valued domain. He would instead be transferred to a much smaller domain in the east. What is interesting to note here is that parts of this event are depicted in flashbacks within the film Harakiri, as the main character Tsugumo Hanshiro was actually a Fukushima samurai who lost his position and became a ronin due to the injustice placed upon his lord Masanori for the repair of the castle. But for Masanori himself, this incident illustrates just how far the shogunate was willing to go to enforce their authority, even if it meant hammering down harsh punishment upon a loyal war hero such as Masanori. Now, besides just enforcing their will, there have been other possible ideas as to why this whole incident even occurred in the first place. One theory was that it was largely to keep Masanori in line, someone who was perhaps viewed cautiously due to previous behavior, while another theory makes Masanori the casualty of a higher-up political squabble between 2 high-ranking Bakufu officials, which in the end resulted in Masanori getting burned for their heated dispute. Whatever the case, Masanori was made an example of just how far the shogunate would go to suppress the many daimyo, which they would continue to do. Records indicate that strict enforcement of laws of the Buke Shohato would end up negatively impacting up to around 100 daimyo by 1650, through either total or partial confiscation of their territory. The incident with Masanori just happens to be one of the earliest and most well-known. What is interesting to note was that this incident occurred rather late in Hidetada's tenure as shogun, as we need to remember that he had been holding the title since way back in 1605, and it would only be 4 years later, in 1623, that he would choose to retire, just as his father had done. Yet Hidetada was only 44 years old at the time, compared to Ieyasu who retired when he was around 62. In his place, Hidetada left his son, Tokugawa Ieyasu, another interesting figure who we will get into in the next episode. Yet for now, Hidetada would continue to pretty much run the nation while in retirement, once again, just like his father. And we can see rather quickly that one of his primary concerns while in retirement was actually in terms of foreign affairs. While Ieyasu had been much more interested with things abroad and building trade relations with the West, Hidetada appears to not have shared this fascination. It is also important to note that once Hidetada had come to full power after Ieyasu's death, that significant figures like William Adams, who were so instrumental in building trade relations, were swept aside. Hidetada had his own council of advisors, his own figures to help guide the nation, not all the same men that his father had worked with, so that when he finally came to full power, the regime change also meant moving beyond figures like Adams. And this is also significant because it is with Hidetada that we can start to see the groundwork being laid for Japan's eventual full closure to much of the outside world. One element of this which had been a pressing concern for some time had been regarding the introduction and spread of Christianity, which had previously had harmful effects in Japan. But on the other hand, efforts to build stronger trade relations with the West had also become increasingly stagnant and frustrating. It also did not help that several of the countries that Japan wanted to build trade with were also at each other's throats. Such was the case in particular for Spain, that continually held back from trading with Japan unless Japan not only kicked out any Dutch and English, but were also open to allowing more Catholic missionaries in. These were all things that obviously Japan was unwilling to do. Not to mention that it appears much of Hidetada's efforts in retirement are said to have revolved heavily around the persecution of Christians in Japan. The situation between Japan and the West had already become somewhat murky by this point, as even back in 1616 Hidetada had begun to restrict Western trade ships, specifically those coming into major ports at Nagasaki and Hirado. Early efforts like these would continue to build into the wider policy of Sakoku, which would in time be achieved through many edicts which worked to close Japan off to much of the outside world. We will come to explore more of this in the episodes to come. As for now though, we can see that foreign relations were not going well. Although Japan was allowing Chinese trade to continue in what appears to be a rather uninterrupted capacity, things would continue to deteriorate for much of the Western trade. Eventually, seeing no real incentive to continue operations, England would close their trading office in Japan in 1623, in the same year that Hidetada retired. And it would only be 1 year later that Japan would officially break off relations with Spain. Through all of this though, Dutch trade would continue on, largely through Dejima in Nagasaki. Hidetada would eventually come to pass away peacefully in 1632, as one of the last samurai lords to have seen warfare throughout the end of the Sengoku period. Leaving his son, Shogun Ieyasu, behind, he would entrust him with continuing the work that both Ieyasu and Hidetada had started in perfecting the systems of the shogunate. In the end, the story of Tokugawa Hidetada is an interesting one. A figure who was not born destined to rule, but would eventually find himself in that very spot. Someone who eagerly tried and failed to prove himself in warfare, but would later shine as a competent administrator, working alongside his father to build the early pillars of the Tokugawa Shogunate. Yet, the work of cementing the real foundation of the Bakufu was not quite done, and as we will come to see, it will fall to Hidetada's son to finish the process. As in the next episode, we will look to cover the story of Tokugawa Ieyasu, whose own reign would come to see some of the most significant developments of the entire period. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.